Good evening. So, obedience is detachment from the self. This is the most radical detachment of all. But what is self? The self is the principle of reason and responsibility in us. It is the root of freedom. It is what makes us men. B.D. Griffiths, aka Alan Richard Griffiths, aka Swami Dayananda. This is about how we have sold our souls through the subtleties of fear. Psychological warfare is the name of the game. Cooperating with the legal system is the trap of the game. We live every day in the system. It's hard to have a normal and in the social vein of society a life without at least visiting the system, making ourselves subject to being seen by law enforcement and people we can't trust. Primary example: it's 4 a.m. You're driving at a dark and quiet intersection in the city. You can see all lanes of traffic. The light is this light is a particularly long one. You could run this red light, and no harm, no foul, no malicious intent. Nobody's gonna get hurt in any way, shape, or form. You know, you're just moving on with things. You just don't like to wait. Now, I'm not advocating running red lights. This is just an example. But we don't run that light because we don't know if there is a camera or a cop around the corner, and we think we will be fucked and have our driving privileges under threat if we do. So we fall in line because we think it's not worth it and will never change anything. Now, granted, running red lights probably shouldn't be changed, even if it's perfectly safe at 4 in the morning, although it is very obnoxious to think that you'll be pestered for breaking such a law when there's no harm or foul. However, there are more serious petty offenses in this world. This is what we do with a heightened security state. We get people to care about a security issue, and as long as we agree that this issue is important, they can manifest a story that justifies its need. It's the McCarthy-era psychological torture we allow because we always assume that law only applies to the other. Drug war, for instance, only used to apply to Mexicans and blacks until the 60s, when everybody started doing it. But by then, they had already changed the culture and established the black market system, so they had to double down on it, not to stop the drug flow, but to control it. Plain and simple. You know, because you don't want all of a sudden, rogue drug cartels that aren't being run by the CIA, etc., etc., and then on the cultural aspect of things, there are people that genuinely want to actually stop drug flow, so they pass a bunch of laws in respect to that. So that's a main way that we can look at this. Now, what am I really getting at? Because I'm not going into a drug war rant, although believe me, that episode is coming. The reason medical laws are enforced is because doctors fear that someone who agrees with that system will take their privilege of legally performing medicine will be taken away because there's some law that some doctor has to follow that, even though in their heart of hearts they know is a foolish law that's actually getting in the way of health, it doesn't matter because maybe the nurse believes in that system or will one day just, in her lack of the full knowledge of the situation, just believe that the doctor is in fact doing more harm. This is the reason why a lot of people will consent to a law even if they don't fully like it, but the law is there, thus the law is the law. That's how the bureaucrats work. Now remember this, a cop is just a bureaucrat with a badge and a gun. It wasn't always like that, but because the law has gotten so complicated, and because, you know, there's so much tiptoeing around the rules going on, they train these cops in how to deceive us, so, you know, they know the law and know what they should be telling us and what they shouldn't, to trick us into getting ourselves into further trouble. And that's how these bureaucrats work. And, you know, they've got that almighty law as a protection for as long as the system can support it. So, even if you're the subject of harassment and threat, it does its job. Even if you are just, is what I mean, a subject of harassment and threat, meaning you never actually get any trouble, there's no ticket issue, no threat, no warning per se, but the point is that you had this interaction with this cop over what he wanted to bother you about, and make you believe that you're a criminal. The job of the mental conditioning and what the elites like about that has come across. That's how they get their way one way or the other. Either you're conforming to this wonderful little screwed up system that they have, or you're just ultimately going to rebel against it. But you won't rebel against it in a way that works out for you. It'll be a rebellion that allows them to further the agenda, because they know that they have to further the conditioning, and part of the further conditioning is to have a negative reaction from the public. They don't want you to know the true power that you have. That is the point, and they need to take that power away from you before you know you have it. And the reality is that this power goes beyond any actual written laws. So, what is that true power? Oh, it's easy. You have to read the Declaration of Independence. That document is universal in its main body. The right of all mankind, of all nations, have inalienable rights. No matter what happens to the law, the philosophy of America, the philosophy of freedom, is in that document. It is above the law because it is about principles. It is about philosophy. It's in the spirit. It's right there. That's what was going on. That was, what spearheaded the American Revolution. The Constitution is what they worked out afterwards once they finally got rid of their colonial masters. At least in the direct governmental sense. Of course, they never lost control of the economy, which was part of the problem. So in many respects, the wonderful Virginia Company that goes all the way back to the 1600s is still very much in that existence. But that is our power. Not the document itself, but the truth about who we are that it expresses. Because, we don't want to sit there and talk about the whole King George angle, but at the same time, if you look at those two, you tell me what our government is doing that is not unlike the grievances in the Declaration of Independence. It's kind of scary, the parallels between the U.S. government on its own people versus King George against the U.S. colonies. Here's an excerpt. This is the excerpt that I'm basically talking about. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles, and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Do you get that? If you don't, read the full document. Trust me. Sometimes we stress over the Constitution a great deal, but we forget this aspect of it. We're obsessed with the Constitution now, thanks to the libertarian movement. And we're also obsessed with the philosophies of Thomas Jefferson. Well, this is the philosophy of Thomas Jefferson. It is the philosophy of America. The reason we are losing the rule of constitutional law and the rule of law in general is because we forgot the foundation of our argument. That was the brilliance of Thomas Jefferson, the philosopher. Forgive him that he owned slaves, okay? Just after you forgive the Greeks who birthed democracy, that they owned slaves. But we still, we're still working off of that. And actually, if you look at history, we've gone through a history of the world is full of less slaves and less dehumanized and subjugated people. As much as there's this unfortunate resurgence of violence and war and violent rebellion and etc., etc. Often it's just repackaging the control, and we're switching from a physical enslavement to a psychological enslavement is what happens. But what happens with that is that it's forcing them to play a psychological game. And if they can't win that psychological game, what's happening is that we are growing more conscious as a people. Because this is part of our evolution of consciousness. When we can, we understand what physical slavery is. Now we have come to really understand what psychological slavery is. And if you ask me, consciousness is just a scientific word for the soul. Science doesn't want to acknowledge the soul, so they called it something else that they can talk about in ways of measuring electrical activity in the brain, etc., etc. When the truth is that still, they're using the brain activity to see the soul, if you will, but that's not the source of it. But that's getting into some whole other existential, spiritual, scientific spiritual crossovers. That I digress from. So, what do we do now? That's the question. Well, the Occupy Wall Street movement began to get it right. They rebelled with love and peace, which, sounds like a regurgitation of the 60s, sure, but it's a lot different. It's a lot more complicated, and it wasn't just about culture and lifestyle, which is what most of the 60s rebellion was about. It was just about culture, lifestyle, and, unified under war protest, because it started with protesting the Vietnam War, and then that protest and peace and love kind of evolved into the hippie movement as it went. You can look at the early 60s and what Vietnam protesters looked like, and you look at the early 70s and look at what they looked like, and it was completely different as far as the looks of people, the culture, and the values. So, the other thing is they refused to play ball with the moneyed and political powers that be. They also refused to accept what was told to them without thinking about it first. In this turmoil, this group has had a paradigm shift that cannot be controlled. They have learned that the Democrats and the Republicans don't care about them. And even if they want socialism, they want a system that doesn't create more want. It's okay that the libertarians don't own the whole revolution, because we don't have all the answers, so we shouldn't own all of the revolution. We just have a more uniform message, because I think we've been thinking about it longer, and we're looking into a great deal of other studies that these newer kids are just now figuring out, and are just now having their foundations rattled, because they didn't know any better, because their parents either didn't know any better or didn't know how to teach them well in that respect. We just know that the government needs a separation of power, and we both believe, whether it's the Occupy, the liberal part of this revolution, or the conservative part of this revolution, we both believe in a separation from private enterprise and that government. We just know that there's something vile and corrupt about it, and that's the common ground. And that's the rally cry that can have somebody like Ron Paul win this election, because he bridges that gap. He walks between both worlds, to sound funny about it. But he literally does, as opposed to just pandering to people. That's why he's consistent. He doesn't pander. He's got his belief system, and he just puts it out there. And it's just like, vote for me if this is your value system, and that's it. as opposed to like sitting there and talking about the right height of the trees and other funny and ridiculous things in politics. But I digress. To getting back to the point about the psychological shackles, we have dozens of local laws from everything from dress code and eating in public to legitimate violent crimes and everything in between. And we fear so much that we tricked ourselves into believing we need some of these petty laws and more cops to handle those laws. But unfortunately, because those laws do eventually look stupid, but those cops can't lose their jobs, they either start making more laws to justify those jobs in existence, despite the taxes involved with, hiring these cops and their pensions and their insurances and et cetera, and we perpetuate the police state further, just because we want to feel bad about laying off an officer of the law and telling him to go find a better purpose for his life. Because that allegedly is rude and taboo. Anyway, the key to this is to refit society to not fear anymore. Stop fearing drugs. Stop fearing terrorists and spies. Stop fearing alternative lifestyles and how to civilly and peaceably defend yourself. To not worry about Big Brother or even Little Brother, because Little Brother you can call those especially the local level, because odds are when you interact with a cop, he's going to be your local town police officer, city police officer. He's not going to be a federal officer. The little girl's wilding out today. I don't know what's up with her. She's usually well behaved. Come here, baby. So, listen, no matter how much security we have, the real threat out there, the real threats that are out there are allowed or done by the government. 9/11 conspiracy and drug war CIA relationship has taught us that. All right? It's all nonsense. It's all a big psyop. If these things are going to happen, they're going to happen regardless. The fiction is that we let them get away with what they want from their sick games. That is how the 1900s to the 1930s worked, with the prohibitions and the anarchists. Al Capone and Luigi Galliani had their part to play in this game. So try your best to know the Bill of Rights, and do your best to know your state Bill of Rights, which should be in harmony with the federal bill. Never be hostile with police, but never give them what they don't have the power to do. If you are breaking a law that hurts no one but yourself, or not even yourself, stand by your actions. You give the cops no information, and when you get to court, you don't play their game. If you can be proven to be breaking a law you know to be unjust, then that is your case, and you fight for a jury trial and take the power to convict you from the judge and let your peers make the decision and make the argument. Be prepared to be in contempt of court. This is a battle for your soul and your sovereignty. You might not find a lawyer willing to help you this way. The secret is that if there is enough corruption in this system, then your case will be dismissed, and that is a victory. Because at the end of the day, they don't want to make a bigger deal out of it if it means a furthering investigation, to bring up the various forms of evidence and questioning where that evidence came from and sources, and then what happened with this, that, and the other thing, especially if it's something drug-related. I always speak in that way because I'm very educated in the drug war, because I do fight in the political system for the drug war. I have done that, and I continue to do so. So listen, this isn't a perfect answer, and it is very risky, especially coming from me. I speak from the heart, and I use my head, but it is an overwhelming subject. But many of you might have innate knowledge that would succeed where I would fail. So I pass my wisdom and my inspiration on to you. As long as you never make a deal with the law will not win when it is unjust. What I have said today can be controversial. If you're well studied in law and come across this, this video, please add comments. This is a very important conversation as we face the reform or destruction of this republic. I appreciate so much your time for listening, and I hope you have a good day.